What happened that day didn't feel like a misunderstanding. It didn't feel like a joke that went too far or a moment that could be brushed aside with nervous laughter. What people reacted to wasn't just the act itself. It was the power imbalance, the context, and the way it was treated afterward. Because when one person has influence, authority, or control over another, the line between joking and harm doesn't blur, it sharpens. At the center of this moment was someone who relied on familiarity, trust, and routine. Someone whose world was already limited, whose sense of safety depended on predictable behavior from those around him. That trust is not something you earn once and then get to misuse. It is something you are responsible for protecting, especially when the other person cannot advocate for themselves in the same way. What shocked people most was not just that the act allegedly occurred, but that it was recorded, labeled, and shared as entertainment. That decision alone reframed everything. Recording something means pausing long enough to decide it's worth keeping. Sharing it means deciding it's worth others seeing. Labeling it with humor means deciding it's worth laughing at. That sequence matters. Because it shows intent, not necessarily malicious intent, but reckless disregard. And recklessness, when it involves another person's dignity and bodily autonomy, is not harmless. Many viewers struggled to understand how anyone could believe this was acceptable. They asked questions that couldn't be ignored. Why was proximity so close in a private moment? Why was exposure involved at all? Why was retaliation framed as humor? Why was consent never mentioned? And most importantly, why was the vulnerable person's discomfort treated as secondary to the content? These questions weren't asked to sensationalize. They were asked because something felt deeply wrong. There's a difference between crude humor among equals and degrading behavior imposed on someone who doesn't have equal power. There's a difference between consent and coercion, between mutual joking and humiliation. When one party lacks the ability, or the safety, to say no, the responsibility rests entirely on the person with control. What followed only intensified the reaction. Instead of immediate accountability, there was minimization, deflection, claims that people were overreacting or twisting things. But outrage didn't come from imagination. It came from what people saw, heard, and understood in context. When viewers saw discomfort followed by forced normalization, an attempt to smooth things over with laughter or physical closeness, it raised even more concern. Because that pattern is familiar. It's what happens when someone learns that compliance is safer than resistance. When they've been conditioned to keep the peace rather than protect themselves. That realization was heartbreaking for many. Supporters who once defended involvement began re-evaluating everything they had previously excused. Moments that once seemed odd now felt alarming. Boundaries that were never clearly respected suddenly stood out in hindsight. The trust they had placed in someone to act responsibly now felt misplaced. This wasn't about hate. It wasn't about canceling. It was about recognizing harm and refusing to minimize it. People also began asking harder questions about legality, not out of vengeance, but out of concern. Non-consensual exposure. Non-consensual bodily contact. Recording and sharing degrading acts. These are not gray areas when viewed through the lens of law or ethics, especially when vulnerability is involved. And yet, the loudest defense offered was familiarity. They've known each other forever. It was just how they joke. He didn't mean anything by it. But familiarity does not equal permission. History does not erase responsibility. And intention does not override impact. What matters is how the act affected the person on the receiving end, and whether anyone stopped to consider that before hitting record. For many watching, this moment became a line that could not be uncrossed. Not because it was shocking in isolation, but because it represented a pattern of disregard masked as closeness. A failure to protect someone who should have been protected above all else. The outrage wasn't performative. It was protective. People weren't asking for drama. They were asking for acknowledgement, for clarity, for assurance that behavior like this would never be normalized again. Because once humiliation becomes content and discomfort becomes comedy, something has gone very wrong. This wasn't about one clip. It was about what that clip revealed. And once revealed, it couldn't be unseen. Do you believe intent should matter more than impact in situations involving vulnerable individuals? Or should accountability come first, no matter how familiar the relationship? Share your thoughts in the comments. What unsettled people even more after the initial shock was the silence that followed. Not the silence of reflection or accountability, but the kind that feels intentional. No clear explanation. No acknowledgement of harm. No recognition that something deeply personal and invasive had crossed a line. Instead, what many saw was avoidance. Posts disappearing, comments ignored, conversations redirected. That kind of response has weight. When something serious happens and the first instinct is to erase rather than explain, it sends a message. It tells people that protecting an image matters more than addressing what was done. And when the person affected is someone with limited ability to process, protest, or protect themselves, that message feels even heavier. Many supporters struggled internally. Some had followed along for years, believing they were witnessing care, friendship, even advocacy. They had defended uncomfortable moments before, telling themselves they didn't have the full picture. But this moment forced a reckoning. It wasn't vague. It wasn't subtle. It wasn't something that could be misunderstood with context alone. The discomfort was visible. The words spoken were clear. The act itself didn't leave room for interpretation. What made it worse was the framing. Calling it payback. Treating it as humor. Presenting it as a deserved response rather than an inappropriate act. That framing reveals mindset. It shows a failure to understand consent, power, and dignity. Because retaliation of that nature is not a joke, it is an assertion of dominance. And dominance, when directed at someone vulnerable, is never harmless. People began revisiting older content, not to dig for drama, but because once trust breaks, everything before it feels different. Moments that once seemed awkward now felt alarming. Close physical proximity. Private situations recorded for public viewing. Jokes that landed one-sided. Laughter that didn't sound mutual. Patterns emerged. This is often how awareness works, not all at once, but gradually, painfully as pieces fall into place. Viewers weren't imagining things. They were connecting dots that had always been there. The difference was that now they had a clear reference point for why those dots mattered. Another layer that disturbed many was the response from defenders. Instead of asking whether harm occurred, some immediately focused on discrediting those who spoke up. They minimized the seriousness. They reframed the concern as overreaction. They accused critics of having bad intentions, as if questioning behavior automatically meant malice. That response is familiar in situations involving abuse or exploitation. Shift the focus. Attack the messenger. Question motives. Anything but address the act itself. But concern doesn't require hatred. Accountability doesn't require cruelty. And asking hard questions doesn't make someone an enemy. Many people who spoke out did so reluctantly. They didn't want to believe what they saw. They wanted an explanation that made it okay. They wanted reassurance that lines hadn't been crossed. What they got instead was silence or dismissal. That absence of accountability created space for fear. Fear about what else might have happened off camera. Fear about how often boundaries were ignored. Fear about whether the person affected even understood that what happened was wrong. That last question haunted many viewers the most. When someone is taught, explicitly or implicitly, that humiliation is normal, that discomfort should be laughed off, that affection follows degradation. It rewires how they understand relationships. It teaches them that harm and closeness are linked. That to be accepted, they must tolerate being demeaned. That is not friendship. That is conditioning. Legal discussions began circulating not because people wanted punishment, but because they wanted clarity. Laws exist for a reason, to draw firm lines where morality alone sometimes fails. Non-consensual exposure, non-consensual bodily contact, recording degrading acts. These aren't abstract concepts, they're protections designed specifically for situations like this. Whether charges are filed or not doesn't change the ethical reality. Something can be wrong even if it never sees a courtroom. But the possibility that laws may have been violated forced people to confront how serious the situation truly was. This wasn't boys being boys. It wasn't roughhousing. It wasn't mutual joking. It was an act involving bodily fluids, exposure, humiliation, and power imbalance. Stripping that down to its basics makes it impossible to defend honestly. And yet, some still tried. What many found hardest to accept was how easily vulnerability was dismissed. How quickly people moved to protect the person with the platform instead of the person without a voice. How sympathy flowed upward rather than toward the one most affected. That imbalance mirrors the original problem. As discussions continued, one thing became clear. This moment changed how people saw everything. Trust once broken doesn't quietly return. Even if explanations eventually come, the damage lingers. Because trust isn't just about believing someone won't hurt you. It's about believing they understand why certain things are unacceptable in the first place. And that understanding seemed absent here. For many, this wasn't about outrage anymore. It was about drawing a boundary as a community, saying collectively that there are lines that should never be crossed for content, humor, or control. That vulnerability is not a prop. That dignity is not optional. People wanted assurance that someone was finally prioritizing protection over profit, respect over attention, humanity over views. Whether that assurance ever comes remains uncertain. But what is certain is that this moment forced a conversation that could no longer be avoided. A conversation about consent, about power, about responsibility, and about what it truly means to care for someone who depends on you. Do you think public accountability is necessary when private harm is made public? Or should silence be respected if explanations never come? Share your thoughts below. As the conversations deepened, something else became impossible to ignore: how quickly narratives can harden when audiences are emotionally invested. For some, the idea that harm occurred felt threatening, not just to their view of a person, but to their sense of judgment. Admitting that something was wrong meant admitting they may have overlooked warning signs, defended behavior too quickly, or trusted someone who didn't deserve it. That kind of realization is uncomfortable, and discomfort often turns into resistance. So instead of asking, "Was this wrong?" the question became, "Why are people making such a big deal out of this?" But that question misses the point. The size of the reaction isn't about spectacle. It's about vulnerability. It's about what happens when someone with social power, confidence, and control interacts with someone who lacks those things, and then treats that interaction as entertainment. When one person sets the tone, decides what's funny, and controls the narrative, the other person's reaction doesn't determine consent. Silence isn't permission. Confusion isn't agreement. A nervous laugh isn't approval. And that's what many people finally began to articulate. There was also a growing awareness of how normalized humiliation had become in certain online spaces. Over time, audiences are conditioned to accept increasingly invasive behavior as content. Boundaries erode slowly. What once would have been unthinkable becomes tolerated, then defended, then dismissed. And when someone finally says this isn't okay, they're told they're being dramatic, sensitive, or hateful. But harm doesn't become harmless just because people are used to seeing it. Another aspect that troubled viewers was how often the language of help had been used to justify control. Helping someone doesn't mean owning their moments, their body, or their dignity. It doesn't mean deciding what happens to them without their understanding. True support is quiet, respectful, and centered on the other person's needs, not on creating moments that draw attention or praise. Many started asking questions they hadn't considered before. Who decides what is shared publicly? Who benefits from that sharing? Who bears the cost when something goes wrong? And most importantly, who gets to say no? These questions didn't come from a place of cruelty. They came from a growing sense that something fundamental had been overlooked: agency. Agency isn't about whether someone smiles or stays close. It's about whether they have real choices, real understanding, and real power to refuse without consequence. When there's a power imbalance, emotional, intellectual, financial, that agency is compromised. And when that imbalance is ignored, even unintentionally, harm can follow. People also began reflecting on how easily they had accepted narratives presented to them. How often they assumed good intentions were enough. How frequently they excused discomfort because it seemed fine at the time. That self-reflection was painful, but necessary. Because awareness isn't just about calling out others. It's about recognizing how systems of attention and loyalty can blind us. The silence from those directly involved continued to echo. Not because anyone was owed a public confession, but because silence in moments like this doesn't feel neutral. It feels like avoidance. And avoidance leaves space for speculation, fear, and mistrust to grow. Even a simple acknowledgement of concern, without defensiveness, could have shifted the tone. But that didn't happen. Instead, people were left to wrestle with their own conclusions. Some stepped back entirely, choosing not to engage anymore. Others stayed, hoping for clarity or change. A few doubled down on defense, framing criticism as an attack on their identity as supporters. The community fractured, not because of disagreement, but because of how people responded to vulnerability being questioned. What became clear is that this wasn't just about one incident. It was about a culture that rewards shock, loyalty, and control over care, reflection, and humility. A culture where saying, "This made me uncomfortable," is treated as betrayal rather than concern. And yet, there was also something hopeful emerging. More people began to speak openly about boundaries. About the difference between inclusion and exploitation. About how easily good intentions can slide into harmful behavior when no one is willing to say stop. Survivors of other situations shared their experiences, not to draw attention to themselves, but to explain why moments like this matter. Why they can't be brushed off. Why they linger long after the video ends. Those voices mattered. They reminded everyone that harm isn't always loud or obvious. Sometimes it looks like laughter. Sometimes it looks like closeness. Sometimes it looks like something everyone else is telling you is normal, even when your body, your instincts, or your conscience say otherwise. As time passed, the initial shock faded, but the questions didn't. They settled into something heavier, more enduring. What responsibility do content creators have when working with vulnerable people? What safeguards should exist? Who enforces them when the audience is split? And what does accountability actually look like when harm is social, emotional, and public? There are no easy answers. But ignoring the questions isn't one of them. For many, this became a turning point, not just in how they viewed one situation, but in how they consumed content altogether. They became more cautious, more skeptical, less willing to excuse discomfort for the sake of entertainment. They started asking who benefits, who is protected, and who is left exposed. That shift matters. Because while one incident can spark outrage, it's sustained awareness that creates change. And change doesn't always come from courts, platforms, or statements. Sometimes it comes from audiences deciding that certain things are no longer acceptable, no matter how familiar the faces involved may be. This wasn't about canceling someone. It wasn't about taking sides. It was about recognizing that dignity is not negotiable and vulnerability is not a punchline. And once that realization takes hold, there's no going back to watching the same way again. As the fallout continued, another uncomfortable truth surfaced. Accountability becomes blurry when harm is wrapped in familiarity. When people feel like they know someone through repeated appearances, casual language, or shared history, they often grant grace they would never extend to a stranger. Familiarity creates emotional shortcuts. It convinces people that intent matters more than impact, that history outweighs present behavior, and that loyalty should come before scrutiny. But harm doesn't measure familiarity. It measures effect. Many supporters clung to the idea that long-term presence automatically meant safety. That because someone had been around for years, they must be trustworthy. That because there were moments of laughter, connection, or apparent affection, nothing harmful could exist beneath the surface. This belief is common, and it's also dangerous. History shows again and again that prolonged access doesn't prevent abuse, it often enables it. Another layer people began to examine was power disguised as friendship. When one person controls transportation, money, exposure, or opportunities, the relationship isn't equal, no matter how casual it appears. Even when both people smile, even when both people seem close, the imbalance still exists. And imbalance changes everything. The question stopped being, did this person mean harm? And became, was harm possible in this dynamic? That shift mattered. Because focusing on intent allows people to avoid responsibility. Focusing on impact forces reflection. It asks whether safeguards were in place, whether consent was informed, and whether the vulnerable person truly had the ability to say no without fear, confusion, or consequence. People also began to talk more openly about how humor is often used to mask cruelty. Calling something a joke doesn't erase what it does to the person on the receiving end. Laughing afterward doesn't undo humiliation. Humor becomes a shield, a way to deflect criticism and frame discomfort as overreaction. But jokes require shared understanding. Without that, they become tools of dominance. As more voices joined the conversation, patterns emerged. The behavior wasn't isolated. It existed within a broader environment where boundaries were already thin, where invasive moments were normalized, and where vulnerability was routinely exposed for public consumption. Seen together, the incident wasn't shocking, it was predictable. That realization was unsettling for many who had supported the situation in good faith. People began asking why it took something so extreme for alarm bells to ring. Why earlier moments of discomfort had been dismissed. Why concerns raised in the past were labeled as jealousy, hatred, or drama instead of caution. These questions didn't come from outsiders alone. They came from people who had once defended the very behavior they were now rethinking. That kind of reckoning is hard. It forces people to accept that good intentions don't guarantee good outcomes. That caring about someone doesn't excuse poor judgment. That helping without listening can still cause harm. And that silence, especially from those with influence, can be as damaging as action. Another issue that gained attention was how quickly responsibility was shifted away from the person with power. Conversations often drifted toward the vulnerability of the victim instead, questioning their reactions, their understanding, their behavior. This reversal is familiar in many harmful situations. It places the burden on the least protected person to justify their discomfort, rather than on the most powerful person to justify their actions. But vulnerability is not a flaw. It's a condition that demands protection. Some began to acknowledge that the situation revealed a deeper cultural problem, the way audiences are taught to consume people instead of stories. When real lives become content, empathy erodes. Viewers stop asking how someone feels and start asking how something plays on screen. That shift changes behavior behind the camera too. When reactions matter more than well-being, lines get crossed. The longer the silence stretched, the more it spoke. Not every situation requires a public explanation, but when harm is public, ignoring it feels dismissive. Even a pause, a moment of reflection, would have shown awareness. Instead, the lack of response reinforced the sense that accountability was being avoided, not considered. Yet amid the anger and disappointment, something else was happening quietly. People were learning. Parents were talking to their children about boundaries. Caregivers were discussing consent in clearer terms. Viewers were re-evaluating what they consider acceptable entertainment. These conversations didn't trend, but they mattered. They mattered because they moved the focus away from personalities and back to principles. What does respect look like when someone is vulnerable? What does consent require beyond a smile or proximity? What responsibilities come with influence, access, and control? And when something feels wrong, why are we taught to doubt ourselves instead of the situation? These questions lingered, unanswered but necessary. By this point, it was clear that the damage wasn't limited to one person. Trust had eroded across the entire situation. People felt misled, conflicted, and complicit. Some felt angry at those involved. Others felt angry at themselves for not seeing it sooner. Many felt both. But anger, when directed thoughtfully, can become clarity. Clarity about the need for boundaries. Clarity about the importance of consent. Clarity about the dangers of power imbalance. Clarity about the responsibility of audiences to question what they're shown. This wasn't about revenge or outrage. It was about drawing a line and saying that some things are not entertainment, not jokes, and not acceptable, no matter who is involved. And once that line is drawn, it changes how people watch, who they trust, and what they're willing to excuse. If you've read this far, share your thoughts respectfully. Conversations like this matter, and hearing different perspectives helps move them forward. By the time people reached this point in the conversation, the shock had settled into something heavier. Not outrage, not disbelief, but a sober recognition that something fundamental had gone wrong, and that it couldn't be undone by excuses, silence, or reframing. What lingered wasn't just anger. It was grief. Grief for trust that had been broken, for dignity that had been compromised, and for the realization that vulnerability had not been protected when it mattered most. One of the hardest truths people had to confront was this: harm doesn't always come from strangers. It often comes from familiarity. From people who are allowed too close without guardrails. From relationships that blur lines until no one is quite sure where boundaries should have been drawn in the first place. And once those boundaries are crossed, everything that came before is reinterpreted through a different lens. Moments that once seemed harmless now felt uncomfortable. Jokes that once earned laughter now carried an edge. Physical closeness that once looked friendly now raised questions. This isn't hindsight bias, it's pattern recognition. When one serious violation becomes visible, it forces people to examine the surrounding behavior more carefully. That process is deeply unsettling, especially for those who supported the situation early on with good intentions. Many people didn't want to believe that harm could exist alongside acts of help or generosity. They struggled with the idea that someone could do both, offer support in some moments while causing damage in others. But human behavior isn't binary. People are capable of kindness and cruelty, sometimes within the same relationship. Recognizing that complexity doesn't excuse wrongdoing, it makes accountability even more necessary. Another realization took hold. silence protects the wrong people. When troubling behavior is met with excuses, minimization, or deflection, it sends a message, not just to the person harmed, but to anyone watching. It says that discomfort will be ignored, that power will be defended, that raising concerns will lead to backlash rather than protection. This is how harmful environments sustain themselves, not through one action alone, but through repeated failures to respond. What many found hardest to accept was how quickly blame shifted away from the act itself and onto reactions. People debated tone instead of substance, motives instead of impact. They asked why others were making a big deal instead of asking why the situation was allowed to happen at all. This kind of deflection doesn't neutralize harm, it amplifies it. At its core, the issue wasn't about public perception or online backlash. It was about consent, dignity, and responsibility. These are not flexible concepts. They don't change based on familiarity, history, or popularity. They exist to protect people who may not be able to protect themselves fully. And that protection failed. As time went on, some supporters began to speak openly about their own discomfort. They admitted they had felt uneasy before but hadn't known how to articulate it. Others said they stayed quiet because they feared being attacked or dismissed. These admissions weren't confessions of guilt. They were acknowledgments of how pressure and loyalty can silence even well-meaning people. This, too, is part of the lesson. When communities revolve around personalities instead of principles, accountability becomes optional. Loyalty replaces ethics. Criticism is seen as betrayal. And those dynamics create conditions where harm can occur unchecked. Breaking that cycle requires courage, not just from those directly involved, but from everyone who chooses to speak honestly rather than comfortably. There was also a growing understanding that vulnerability doesn't disappear because someone is an adult. Cognitive limitations, dependency, and long-term isolation all affect a person's ability to understand, consent, and respond. Treating vulnerability as something that can be ignored once someone reaches a certain age is not only inaccurate, it's dangerous. Protection must be contextual. It must consider capacity, not just appearance. Another painful truth emerged. Once something is made public, it can never be fully taken back. Removing content doesn't erase the experience. Apologies don't restore dignity automatically. The impact lives on, in memory, in trust issues, in the way people view themselves and others. This is why responsibility must be exercised before harm occurs, not after. By now, many people were no longer asking for explanations. They were asking for standards. What behaviors are unacceptable, no matter the relationship? What boundaries should never be crossed, regardless of intent? What safeguards must exist when someone has power over another person's environment, resources, or exposure? These are not questions for courts alone. They are questions for communities, audiences, and anyone who participates, actively or passively, in situations involving vulnerable individuals. Some found it tempting to disengage entirely, to label the whole situation as too messy or too upsetting and move on. But disengagement has consequences too. When attention fades without accountability, patterns repeat elsewhere. Silence becomes precedent, and the people most at risk remain unprotected. Still, there was a shift happening. More people began emphasizing that criticism is not cruelty, that calling something out is not hatred, that protecting vulnerable individuals does not require destroying anyone else. It requires enforcing boundaries that should have existed all along. These distinctions mattered because they reframed the conversation away from personal attacks and toward ethical responsibility. What remains now is not a neat resolution, but an obligation. An obligation to listen when something feels wrong. An obligation to center impact over intent. An obligation to protect dignity over content. An obligation to remember that access is not entitlement. And an obligation to speak, even when it's uncomfortable. This story will not end with a single statement, post, or reaction. Its outcome depends on what people do next, whether they reflect or deflect, whether they demand better or accept less, whether they choose empathy over entertainment. If there is any lasting value to come from this, it will be in changed behavior, clearer boundaries, stronger protections, and a refusal to excuse harm simply because it comes from someone familiar. If you've read this far, your voice matters. Share your thoughts respectfully. Conversations like this don't change anything unless people are willing to engage honestly. Thank you for watching this video. Click here to watch another video that might interest you.